Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, we will explore the topic, how were women educated in the Middle Ages? Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos about the Middle Ages, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Within the early Center Ages, schooling for women used to be a rare and typically impossible privilege. The present societal norms and constructions of the time, steeped in devout and feudal ideologies, dictated that women's roles were predominantly concerned about the loved ones and household. This period, stretching from roughly the 5th to the 10th centuries, witnessed the fragmentation of the Roman Empire and the upward thrust of feudalism. Amidst these enormous societal changes, females had been largely excluded from the formal schooling techniques that were starting to emerge, peculiarly these reserved for the elite male classes. The Church played a crucial role in shaping the educational landscape throughout this time. Monasteries, which were the facilities of studying, as a rule, furnished some level of schooling. Nevertheless, it was once ordinarily restrained to religious teachings. Monks and nuns were the main sources of knowledge, and their teachings interested in literacy, prayers, and the interpretation of religious texts. These institutions had been among the many few locations the place ladies would receive an schooling. However, their access used to be commonly confined to people who had entered religious existence. For many women, the only education on hand to them used to be at home, the place they had been taught common home capabilities. The education of ladies used to be particularly founded around practical skills that will allow them to run a family, cooking, cleansing, sewing, and caring for youngsters. These abilities were deemed primary for their future roles as better halves and mothers, and the value placed on them was closely tied to the expectations of ladies in medieval society. The inspiration of finding out as a method for mental development or private development was no longer a priority in the lives of most females throughout this time. However, no longer all ladies have been restrained to such restrained academic possibilities. Women from noble families, for example, had a greater danger of receiving some type of formal schooling. These females, by and large daughters of lords and women, might be taught by using tutors or sent to religious associations, where they would obtain an extra diverse schooling. This could sometimes comprise reading, writing, and normal arithmetic. Despite these rare occasions of higher studying, the schooling of noble ladies was still heavily tied to their roles as other halves, moms, and political figures of their households. In the early medieval interval, the suggestion of a lady searching for mental progress for its possessed sake used to be almost unheard of. As an alternative, studying was as a rule pursued to serve functional purposes inside the confines of society's inflexible structure. Education, on this field, was rarely viewed as a method of empowerment or self-advancement, but as an alternative, as a tool for reinforcing social order. Via the 12th century, a slow transformation started out to take position. This interval, referred to as the High Core Ages, saw the institution of the primary universities, the institution of Bologna, the tuition of Paris, and others like them were based, notably for guys who were being trained for roles within the clergy, regulation, and executive. Even as these associations were nonetheless predominantly dominated, they represented a shift within the mental climate of Europe. Females, nonetheless, remained mostly excluded from this educational world. But this exclusion was once no longer absolute. Some women from noble or rich families have been in a position to access schooling via their fathers, brothers, or even husbands. A few women, especially those in devout orders, managed to acquire mental awareness, though these situations were the exception rather than the guideline. Some females who entered the convents received schooling in literature, arts, and languages that have been increasingly being furnished to male students. In these rare cases, females could come to be well versed in texts that explored philosophy, theology, and historical past. One extremely good instance from this interval is Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, writer, composer, and philosopher who lived within the 12th century. Hildegard's intellectual achievements have been first-rate, given the limitations positioned on females of her time. She composed music, wrote about usual science, and corresponded with popes and emperors, supplying advice on issues of governance and spirituality. Hildegard's work validated that some females, regardless of the overwhelming societal obstacles, would engage with mental goals, although they were nonetheless restrained through the patriarchal structures that governed their lives. even as experiences like that of Hildegard had been satisfactory. They helped pave the way in which for later generations of females, who would ultimately in finding more avenues for schooling and self-expression. Nevertheless, for most females in the early Middle Ages, education remained a distant perfect rather than a tangible reality. Their lives have been shaped with the aid of the demands of daily survival, and the schooling they got was most likely constrained to the expertise integral for managing a family, raising youngsters, and serving their families. Because the core, a while progressed, the gradual emergence of an extra-structured form of education for ladies would begin to take shape. But in these early centuries, the opportunities for ladies to attain an A schooling have been few and far between. The fact of females' education within the center a while was one among exclusion, drawback, and by and large, silence. As the centuries of the middle a while unfolded, the role of the church grew to become much more relevant to the constitution of education. By the 10th and 11th centuries, monasteries and convents had ended up one of the crucial few associations where females could receive any type of formal education. For females in these devout orders, schooling was intertwined with devout life. The convents, in certain, served no longer best as areas of worship and spiritual retreat, but in addition, as facilities of learning, albeit on a so much smaller scale than the male-dominated monasteries and universities. In the early center a while, ladies' entry to these devout educational associations used to be reasonably confined, most commonly limited to these of noble or wealthy beginning who might manage to pay for to support a lifestyles within the convent. These ladies would be trained to read and write, as a rule in Latin, as the church dominated intellectual lifestyles and communication throughout this interval. Education in these religious settings used to be mostly founded round devout text spread, psalms, and the Bible. For many females, this devout education fashioned the groundwork of their learning, with little to no exposure to the broader mental actions of the time. The schooling of women within the convents, even as still generally restricted to the devout sphere, was once one of the few shops for intellectual progress. Devout texts, although particularly situated on devotion, additionally carried philosophical, theological, and even scientific recommendations. The nuns who had access to those works started to interact with suggestions about the nature of the arena, the human soul, and the intricacies of theology. Their studying, nonetheless, used to be consistently framed inside the confines of religious responsibility. The notion of education as a form of personal or intellectual fulfillment was once nonetheless mostly absent from their world. In one of the vital, more distinguished convents, such because the noted Abbey of the Holy Cross in Poitiers, women were repeatedly ready to obtain advanced training. These abbeys mainly had libraries. The placebooks were transcribed and illuminated. This allowed a few of the females within the convents to gain entry to texts that had been in any other case reserved for guys. These works integrated no longer best religious treatises, but in addition elements of classical studying, such because the writings of Aristotle and different historic philosophers. These texts were commonly interpreted by way of the lens of Christian theology. But for ladies who could access them, it opened doorways to a form of intellectual lifestyles that was otherwise closed off. One of the crucial fantastic examples of this religious schooling is found within the figure of Horovitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century nun, poet, and playwright from the Holy Roman Empire. Horovitha is viewed to be some of the earliest known feminine playwrights in Western historical past. She wrote in Latin and produced religious dramas that were deeply influenced by way of classical theatre. Her schooling, although still so much tied to the devout orders of her time, enabled her to have interaction with the mental heritage of the classical world in ways that almost all women would now not. Horovitha's capability to supply her works whilst living in a convent demonstrates that, regardless of the considerable barriers to females' education within the core a while, there have been moments of intellectual flourishing within these associations. Yet, even in convents, women's schooling was mostly restricted by means of their repute within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Most nuns bought normal education that keen on liturgy, non-secular guidance, and the sensible expertise wanted to run a convent. Greater schooling in subjects like philosophy, science, or literature used to be reserved for a small minority. These with specified presence or household connections. The vast majority of women in devout lifestyles had been expected to serve the community, participate in devotional practices, and maintain the day-to-day operations of the convent. Their finding out was once tied to the thought of religious enlightenment, alternatively, than intellectual development or personal empowerment. For women outside the convents, schooling used to be much less available. Few opportunities existed for ladies and females from non-noble households to acquire even basic education. The education they did receive was once most likely established around the residence, the place they realized the potential imperative to control the household. This schooling, whilst priceless in its possessed character, used to be frequently obvious as secondary to the education of guys, which excited by broader intellectual pursuits. Females' roles in society were still chiefly viewed via the lens of their home responsibilities, and the thought that females might aspire to schooling past these limits used to be a rare and now and then subversive thought. Nevertheless, even external to devout associations, there were pockets of female intellectuals who sought out finding out. Some women, specifically in urban areas, sought casual education, in general via reading the Bible and devout texts, as good as by way of interactions with realized men. In these contexts, women sometimes observed ways to gain knowledge. However, these opportunities had been few and a ways between. Because the centuries handed, the Church would proceed to provide the framework for many educational possibilities on hand to women. Nevertheless, this approach would step by step start to shift. By the time the High Centre arrived, a more formal academic method for ladies, one who could prolong past the Church and into the tutorial world, would begin to take form, albeit very slowly and with many boundaries. Still, for many ladies in the core a long time, education remained an elusive intention, one who used to be typically tied to devout provider instead than personal enlightenment. Despite these obstacles, the impact of religious schooling on women in the core a while cannot be understated. For the females who had access to it, the Church served as both a sanctuary and an intellectual haven, delivering possibilities for learning in an or-else male-dominated world. But because the centuries moved on, the decision for more educational possibilities for women would start to develop, paving the way in which for future generations to seek talents in an extra expansive and inclusive manner. As the core a long time stepped forward into the 12th and 13th centuries, the constitution of society began to conform. With the enlargement of feudalism and the institution of extra intricate social hierarchies, the function of aristocratic families and schooling grew to be more outstanding. While nearly all of women remained excluded from the formalized intellectual schooling furnished to men, a small number of women from noble or royal families started out to obtain a more advanced education. The education they bought, nevertheless, used to be still mostly shaped with the aid of the social expectations placed on women, and it almost always remained tied to domestic and devout obligations. Within the wealthier courses, ladies were oftentimes knowledgeable with the aid of confidential tutors or in royal or noble courts. The education of these females, whilst nonetheless often confined to domestic and devout tasks, was once most often reasonably broader than that to be had to lesson courses. Noble females were sometimes taught the basics of studying and writing, though these capabilities have been more commonly noticeable as a way to help them navigate devout texts and fulfill their roles in society. Moreover, noble women might obtain guide in languages such as Latin or French, which were the languages of the courtroom and the church. Still, the most important center of attention of their education used to be on marriage, family, and social duty. In many cases, the schooling of aristocratic women was also designed to organize them for the political and diplomatic roles they would play in their families. It was once now not unique for ladies from noble households to be married into different aristocratic households as a means of securing alliances and strengthening political vigor. The schooling these women received, for this reason, was aimed toward cultivating expertise that may be priceless in managing households, serving as advisors to their husbands, and participating in social and political life. This integrated finding out's the best way to manage estates, supervise servants, and ensure the well-being and welfare of their youngsters. At the same time, this schooling used to be ordinarily functional and deeply rooted in the aristocratic worldview. It also furnished women the opportunity to attain an understanding of the sector beyond the household. Despite the focal point on domesticity, Some aristocratic women had been in a position to make use of their extended social reputation to pursue intellectual interests. They were usually able to access libraries and monasteries that housed works of classical studying, and a few females had been even ready to engage with the emerging intellectual movements of the time. Some of the remarkable examples of an lady who sought intellectual progress is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived in the 12th century. Eleanor was a powerful queen and a purchaser of the arts, recognized for her aid of poets and scholars. She was once informed in the classical tradition and had a deep appreciation for literature, tune, and philosophy. Although she was specifically recognized for her political and diplomatic activities, Eleanor's intellectual targets had been massive for a girl of her time, and she helped foster a cultural atmosphere that inspired mental and creativity. Furthermore, two noble ladies like Eleanor, some ladies in religious orders persevered to upward push above the boundaries of their instances and pursue intellectual lives. Convents and monasteries, as mentioned in previous sections, remained one of the few avenues for ladies to interact with mental pursuits. However, the growing value of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries presented new opportunities for women, albeit in very constrained ways. Universities, that have been notably headquartered for the education of guys, slowly began to open their doorways to a small number of women. Nevertheless, this was once an incredibly infrequent phenomenon, and females' entry to those educational institutions was nonetheless closely restrained. One top-notch example of a woman who sought schooling on this educational world is the German student, philosopher, and theologian Hildegard of Bingen, whose work has already been acknowledged. Though she entered religious life as a nun, Hildegard's mental accomplishments went a ways past the average boundaries of females' education within the core ages. She wrote widely on topics ranging from theology to common science and even remedy. Hildegard's ability to interact with the mental currents of her time, despite the overwhelming obstacles positioned before her as a lady, is a testament to the capabilities of females to contribute meaningfully to intellectual life, even when their possibilities were scarce. In the 13th and 14th centuries, some female scholars started out to emerge in a more public method. These women most often confronted large societal opposition, but their education and scholarly goals have been an indication of the slowly altering attitudes toward ladies' intellectual contributions. Women like Christine de Pizan, French creator, commenced to say their voices within the literary world. Christine's most noted work, The Booklet of Town of Ladies, is a safeguard of women's intelligence and potential, arguing that females were simply as in a position as men in the pursuit of potential and wisdom. Christine's work used to be groundbreaking because it marked an enormous shift in the mental climate of the time. Difficult the prevailing stereotypes about ladies' intellectual inferiority. Even as Christine de Pizan's work was innovative, it remained an exception to the norm. For many females within the center a long time, access to schooling remained constrained and particularly dependent on their social type and the devout orders to which they belonged. Even for noblewomen who had been able to receive some degree of education, their studying used to be more commonly functional and closely linked to their roles in society. Schooling was generally visible as a method to organize ladies for marriage, motherhood, and the administration of households, rather than a course to intellectual or individual fulfillment. For the period of so much of the core a while, ladies' education used to be formed through the rigid social and devout buildings of the time. Nevertheless, as the medieval interval gave way to the Renaissance, ladies commenced to reap extra entry to intellectual possibilities, surroundings the stage for future generations of females to pursue education and scholarship in methods that had previously been unattainable. Nonetheless, even in the later medieval period, the education of women remained generally confined to exact social lessons, and their intellectual contributions endured to be undervalued by using the broader society. As the center a long time stepped forward into the later centuries, the constraints placed on females' education remained formidable. Despite the growing establishment of universities and associations of higher studying for the period of Europe, the function of religion, in particular the Christian Church, continued to be a dominant force, shaping the schooling of women. Despite the fact that the upward push of secular education within the high middle a long time did start to challenge the typical buildings, while some ladies observed ways to attain capabilities the great majority remained excluded from formal intellectual lifestyles, especially on the level of universities and different tutorial institutions. The Church's effect over education was once rooted in its belief that women's foremost rationale used to be to support the family and serve in devout existence. This perception used to be reinforced by means of the notion that ladies, as a result of their perceived emotional and bodily nature, were less suited for mental objectives than men. In this context, schooling for females used to be probably obvious as a means to support their roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers of the house, rather than a software for intellectual development. Even ladies who were good informed in their religious orders or noble families had been ordinarily influenced to make use of their skills for practical purposes, such as managing estates or performing religious tasks, so alternatively than to project the headquartered social order. Nonetheless, regardless of these strong cultural and devout norms, there were normally females who resisted and sought extra. These women often found substitute methods to pursue finding out, sometimes external, the legit channels of schooling. One such avenue was through casual networks of discovered women who would go on abilities by means of oral traditions or personal discussions. In some circumstances, females who had been barred from attending universities or different formal associations of better finding out sought education via the study of religious texts or through engaging with the mental communities in their towns or cities. One outstanding illustration of this quiet mental resistance is the case of the Begins, a religious action of laywomen that began within the 12th century. The Begins were women who lived in semi-monastic communities but did not take formal vows. They were probably equipped to keep a measure of independence, and lots of them engaged within the intellectual lifetime of their communities. Some Begins discovered to learn and write, and they even created their possessed religious and spiritual literature. They were generally independent of male control and had been able to be taught and make a contribution to mental discussions in ways that weren't consistently feasible for different females. Even though the Begin motion was once eventually suppressed via the Church, it highlighted the potential for women to engage with education and mental life when given the possibility. During the 13th and 14th centuries, one other huge progress befell with the rise of the magical lifestyle inside Christianity. Mystics, customarily women, have been oftentimes ready to achieve a degree of intellectual and spiritual recognition. Female mystics, similar to Catherine of Siena, Julian of Norwich, and Teresa of Avila, had been recognized for his or her deep, non-secular insights and theological writings. These females, despite the fact that nonetheless living inside the confines of religious existence, engaged with elaborate theological suggestions and wrote about their mystical experiences, which were often tremendously regarded by male scholars. The Church's eventual acceptance of those females as mental authorities, at the least inside the spiritual sphere, allowed them to make a contribution to the intellectual discourse of their time, albeit from a very restricted and enormously managed function. Whilst the Church did furnish some avenues for females to reap intellectual realization, it remained steadfast in its perception that women's important role was once within the household and the religious neighborhood. For women who weren't part of the aristocracy or devout orders, access to schooling remained a distant dream. The vast majority of ladies lived in rural areas. The place schooling, if it existed in any respect, was almost always situated on sensible abilities integral for survival, akin to farming, animal husbandry, and home obligations. These women, although critical to the functioning of medieval society, had little to no access to formal schooling. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the function of women in schooling commenced to shift, albeit slowly. Some ladies from noble households, akin to Marguerite de Navarre, the sister of King Francois I of France, started out to acquire a more subtle education. They were frequently tutored in Latin and philosophy, and some even developed mental goals that transcended the boundaries of normal women's education. These females started to take part in the burgeoning intellectual and literary actions of the Renaissance. Although their opportunities have been still a long way more restricted than those of their male counterparts, still, the vast majority of women in medieval society remained mostly excluded from larger finding out. Even individuals who did control to receive an schooling, whether or not by way of convents or noble families, were almost always expected to use their expertise to reinforce the popularity, serving their households, overseeing loved ones' concerns, or contributing to religious lifestyles. The thought of women pursuing knowledge for the sake of mental curiosity, self-improvement, or public contribution was once now not commonly authorized. Their studying was once most of the time confined through the same social forces that sought to limit their role in society. The struggles for females' education during the Middle a long time have been marked by contradictions. On one hand, the religious associations and traditions of the time limited women's entry to expertise and intellectual energy. However, the very equal devout structures created spaces where ladies could interact with intellectual life, despite the fact that their participation was confined and often overlooked. Ladies who sought schooling on this interval faced tremendous limitations, but some managed to carve out spaces the place their voices would be heard, even as the schooling of females in the Middle a long time may just look overwhelmingly restrictive. It is primary to note that these ladies, regardless of the constraints placed upon them, contributed to the renovation and transmission of potential in ways that may have an impact on future generations. Ladies in religious life, aristocracy, and even the lay group played roles in shaping the mental and non-secular lifetime of the medieval world, paving the best way for the later achievements of females in the Renaissance and beyond. The anxiety between the religious buildings that restrained females' education and the personal intellectual objectives of women in the course of a long time marked a pivotal interval within the history of women's education. Although the institutional limitations have been titanic, women nonetheless observed approaches to challenge the barriers positioned upon them, contributing to the gradual, however steady shift toward broader academic possibilities in the centuries to come. Because the medieval period got here to a close and Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, the function of females in education started to evolve in ways that were unthinkable within the earlier centuries. The mental atmosphere of the center, despite the fact that restrictive had laid the foundation for future generations of women to engage in schooling more largely, the top of the center marked a turning point, because the sluggish however steady shift towards a more inclusive academic system took root. Atmosphere the stage for women to make more and more foremost contributions to the intellectual and cultural lifetime of Europe, despite the persistent boundaries to schooling for most females for the duration of the Middle The mental contributions of women, though confined in scope and quantity, have been figures reminiscent of Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Marguerite de Navarre, to name a number of, served as key examples of ladies who, through intelligence, decision, and commonly sheer defiance of the norms of their time. 1. Entry to schooling and intellectual life. These women didn't comfortably be given the restrictions imposed on them, but as a substitute sought to contribute to the arena of ideas. Difficult the conventional wisdom of their age, the intellectual efforts of those females, nonetheless, were not continuously acknowledged of their time. Many of their writings, works of art, and philosophical insights had been overshadowed by means of the patriarchal constructions that dominated medieval society. Having said that, the women who persevered in the face of these constraints paved the way for future generations. Their works, some of which were suppressed or forgotten for centuries, would later be rediscovered, influencing the early feminist actions that will emerge in the 17th and 18th centuries. The gradual expansion of educational possibilities for women within the later medieval interval may also be seen within the emergence of a few females who sought formal education in additional secular or educational settings. However, these occasions were rare, as universities and colleges remained virtually exclusively male-dominated institutions. The few females who managed to enter these environments more often than not got here from noble or royal backgrounds. The help of influential households helped them navigate the barriers to entry. Even then, their schooling was once still deeply shaped through their roles as better halves, daughters, and mothers, and was traditionally concerned with preparing them for marriage and household existence, whilst schooling for ladies used to be nonetheless heavily gendered for the duration of the core a long time. The growing curiosity in humanism in the course of the Renaissance began to challenge some of the long-standing beliefs that had restrained women's intellectual possibilities. As the Renaissance unfolded, humanist students commenced to recommend for a broader working out of schooling that included each guys and women. The Renaissance's emphasis on classical skills, literature, and philosophy led to the gradual inclusion of ladies in the world of schooling, even though their participation remained limited in many methods. One of the vital big tendencies for the duration of the Renaissance was the upward thrust of female students and writers who commenced to interact with the humanist ideals that had been flourishing in intellectual circles. These women, mostly expert in noble households or convents, wrote poetry, philosophical treatises, and old works. Some were able to gain tremendous awareness in their time. Isabella d'Este, for example, was an influential consumer of the humanities and an entile figure in Renaissance Italy. She used to be particularly educated and participated within the literary culture of her time, serving to domesticate the intellectual and inventive actions of the interval. Nevertheless, the shift toward broader educational access for ladies was once nonetheless very sluggish and met with resistance. Even as the Renaissance did open the doorways for more women to have interaction with intellectual life, the street was still fraught with obstacles. Females had been customarily discouraged from seeking schooling external the home and had been expected to focal point on home and familial tasks. Because the Renaissance advanced, nevertheless, the concept of women as intellectual equals started out to acquire more traction, specifically within the more modern circles of society. The legacy of medieval ladies' schooling is also evident within the maintenance and transmission of advantage in the course of this period. Convents, where probably the most knowledgeable females of the time lived, have been principal in preserving libraries, copying manuscripts, and passing down classical works. The Bickian movement, which flourished in the course of the core ages, also contributed to the renovation of intellectual traditions, as Bickians in some regions engaged in the production of religious texts and literature, offering ladies with an infrequent avenue for intellectual expression. The education of women during the Middle while nonetheless restrictive by modern-day requisites, laid the groundwork for the later development of ladies' rights to schooling. The struggles of females in medieval times, their intellectual contributions, and the educational possibilities they had been competent to access served because the precursors to the movements of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The voices of women would eventually begin to demand equal access to schooling. Because the centuries handed females commenced to push in opposition to the boundaries set by way of the center a while. They would ultimately wreck free of the boundaries that had lengthy constrained their academic goals, fitting energetic contributors in mental, artistic, and philosophical lifestyles. Nevertheless, it was the foundations laid by the females of the Middle while their perseverance, their intellectual curiosity, and their quiet defiance of the structures that sought to restrict them that made this eventual transformation feasible. In conclusion, while the schooling of females in the core a while was fraught with difficulties, obstacles, and exclusions, the resilience and intellectual contributions of specified women helped to pave the way for a broader attention of females' educational rights in later intervals. The Middle while set the stage for the extra-modern ideas of the Renaissance and beyond, slowly moving towards a time when women's access to education can be seen as now not just a privilege but a proper. The legacy of medieval ladies' schooling is one in every of quiet perseverance and intellectual braveness, which would finally lead to the full flowering of women's educational opportunities in the present-day world.